Hello, I'd like to introduce to you Jeremy Newman, and he's going to talk with us this evening on why he elected to have a common law marriage rather than traditional marriage.
So we got married last July. We've had a lot of people ask since then, and especially at the time, why it was that we decided that a common law marriage was a better option than a traditional marriage license, because virtually everyone you know gets the traditional marriage license. And some people cautioned us against it, some people agreed with it. To some people, it was a big deal, some people didn't think it mattered that much. And in the end, I think that the reason that we came to that conclusion was because we felt that it best matched our understanding of what marriage is supposed to be and what it's supposed to represent. And when anyone's talking about marriage, they always have to go all the way back to the original traditional question of who defines what marriage is, because it's just the place you have to start when you're having the discussion. And there are really kind of only three options for who defines what marriage is to begin with. It's either the state, the church, or God. And sometimes people say the church, meaning God, and sometimes they say the church, distinguishing between the church and God. And so you really have to answer all three separately. And probably the most modernly understood and accepted one, even if this isn't what people would tell you, at least this is what people think most of the time, is that the state is the one who practically defines what marriage is. And that kind of plays out in our culture when you realize how big a deal it is to people when the state changes what they think the definition of marriage is. Because if the state is the one that controls the definition of marriage, once they change that, marriage itself has changed. If the state does not control the definition of marriage, then they may change what they think marriage is, but marriage itself has not changed. And so some people, traditionally it's the Christian community, who will say that the church is the one that defines marriage. And ultimately you have the exact same problem when you say that the church is the one who makes that decision, because the church is still made up of a body of individuals. In theory, it's a body of believers, but it's still a body of individuals. And God has always referred to the church as his church, but the church is still different than God is. And so even today, you have people in the church who will argue that marriage is not between one man and one woman, and they've changed from the traditional view of marriage that Christians have always had up until now. So the third option that you have that is distinctly different from the practical way it plays out in the previous two options is that God is the one who defines marriage. The thing about that is unique is that if God is the one that defines marriage, then it is impossible to change that definition. And so whether culture or even the church or the state decides that it's something different, it cannot be changed. Not just that it shouldn't be, it cannot be. And so that's kind of the premise that I start from when I think through all of these things, that if God is the one that defines marriage, it's not possible to change that definition of marriage. And God is ultimately the one who decides whether you are or are not married. So then the next step, I think, in the evaluation process is to consider culturally what is the problem we're facing right now? Like, how does the culture understand these issues currently? And I mentioned before that I think most people in the culture practically feel like the state is the one that defines marriage. And some people would say the church is the one that defines marriage. But in practice, the way that has played out is that basically no one defines marriage. Because if any one entity, person or state or church, has the power to define marriage, then they also have the power to change what the definition of marriage is. And so now we've ended up in this battle in our culture where we've taken that debate to the state level, to the courts, all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court, to most or maybe all of the Supreme Courts in the states around the country, and all the way to National Supreme Court. And we have this internal national debate over whether marriage should be one thing or should be another thing. And to me, the necessary implication behind that entire debate is that the state has the power to determine what marriage is at all. So you have people on this one side who are arguing that the definition of marriage should be expanded and two men or two women should be able to get married, or now a lot of people even argue that multiple men and multiple women should be able to get married. And it's just a totally different definition than cultures have traditionally accepted and that God teaches. And so Christians have engaged in that debate by going to the state courts and arguing that the state has to defend the definition of marriage. And I certainly understand from a Christian perspective why you would feel like your government has to stick up for what's true. But ultimately, I feel like you also have to ask yourself whose jurisdiction it is to determine that. Because to me, it feels like the Christian community has implicitly yielded to the state the authority to determine what marriage is and is not. Because if the Christian community goes to the state and asks them to clarify that marriage is in fact between one man and one woman, then what happens when the state doesn't agree with you? Well, implicitly, because you went to them arguing that they should make that clarification, if they disagree with you, they have the authority to say it's something else. And the Christian community has implicitly yielded them that authority. So, to me, the entire debate that we're having here kind of begs the question of, does the state's opinion actually change anything? And when the Christian community treats it as if the state's opinion does change something, that implies that the state has the authority to change that in the first place. So, to me, if you're going to argue that the state doesn't have the authority to determine what marriage is, your solution really can't be to go to the state and ask them to defend your definition of marriage. You have to find the source of your defense outside the state's control. So, and people don't really think of this in practical terms frequently, but if you're going to say that the state has the authority to tell you whether you are or are not married, well, usually whether you are married, they also have the authority to tell you whether you are not married. So that begs the question, if you and someone else decide that you're married to each other, and in the eyes of God and in the eyes of both of you and your families, all of you, but the two of you are married together, and the state were to tell you that you weren't properly married, would the state be right? Do they have the authority to do that? Because if the Christian community is correct in assuming that the state can defend or has the authority to defend the definition of marriage, then the state can also come back and tell us that we don't meet that definition of marriage. So if we're not willing to yield the state that authority, we can't go to the state and yield them the authority to defend the definition of marriage in the first place. So having said all of that, to me, the question that is left is, how does the Christian community have to respond to the cultural crisis that you have of struggling over what the definition of marriage is and is not? And if you can't go to the state as your solution, then who do you go to? And I think that really there's an underlying problem that plays itself out in other areas in the Christian community, where the Christian community has gone to the state to ask them to fight the fight for them. And they think that once the state makes that decision, then the fight will be over. And you see that in a lot of areas, but in this area in particular, I think that the bottom line is that the Christian community is going to have to defend the definition of marriage in the community. And if they don't do that, then they will lose the battle. And whether or not the state Supreme Court or Congress or anybody else says that the definition is one thing or is another thing really has no effect if God is the one who defined what marriage was. So for us, when we got married back in July, the question that we were answering or asking ourselves is, what does it imply when we get a traditional marriage license and we go to the state and make an application and request their permission to get married? To me, that implies that the state has the authority to tell me whether I am married or not. And if I believe that God is the one who defines marriage, why would I go to the state to ask them to approve my marriage? And so that was a conflict that I couldn't figure out how to resolve in any way other than getting married outside the state's authority. And to me, it's also an issue of perception, because if people know that you got a marriage license from the state, some people might not think about it because it's normal, but I think that the assumption behind it is still pretty easily understood by most people, that the state was the one who gave you that marriage license, and therefore the state is also the one who could have not given it to you. And in the end, they're the ones who determined whether I was married or not, which I don't believe to be true. And so we opted instead to get a common law marriage. And a lot of people misunderstand what a common law marriage even is. And in fact, we had a lot of friends who, when they cautioned us against it because of a lot of things that you can read on the internet about all the negative side effects legally of getting a common law marriage versus a traditional marriage license. I mean, in reality, the difference between a common law marriage and a traditional marriage license legally is virtually none. The state sees you as married either way. And so you don't run into the problems that everyone says you're going to run into. But for us, the big difference was who is giving you the authority to get married. If I go and ask for a marriage license, it's the state, pretty clearly. Under common law marriage, the way that it works is that you are already married before you go to the state at all. And so, in simple terms, the requirements are that you have to have stayed together for at least one night, and you have to be declaring publicly, treating yourselves publicly as if you were married. And that the state at that point considers that you are married. And so if we had never gone to the courthouse or never gone anywhere and officially told them that we were married, we were already married in the eyes of the law. And so we opted to go to the courthouse anyway and tell them that we were married under a common law marriage, and they'll give you the certificate of common law marriage that you can use to have something to show people so that they can see that you're married. But it's still, to me, a conceptual difference of where the authority came from. Because if I had gone to the state and asked them for a marriage license, implicitly they have the authority to reject me, which means they have the authority to say whether or not I am or am not married. I don't believe they have that authority. But when you get a common law marriage, which you can call it whatever you want, common law marriage is what it's called legally, then whether the state wants you to be married or not is irrelevant. You are married already, and your pastor doesn't have to have any type of certification or approval from the state in order to do that. It's you and your spouse and God that determine whether or not you get married. And to me, that's what's important. So I guess I feel like you kind of have to do for yourself what you think everyone else should do to solve the problem. And so I feel like culturally, our solution to the marriage debate is that we have to treat the state as if their opinion does not matter on the issue of marriage, which means that you have to take them out of the marriage loop completely. So there are a lot of different opinions in the Christian community over whether or not that's a good solution or a bad solution, because they feel like they want something official that they can say is the definition of marriage. Ultimately, I think we have to simply defend what God's word says the definition of marriage is. And so whether or not that complies with the state's definition is not really relevant to me in the end. So there are a lot of different opinions, but for us, I think that's what it came down to. And I think that culturally, that's what will solve our problem if other people do it.